Um, Hello, everybody. I'm Paolo Passaglia, and I'm the coordinator of the summer school. The staff and I decided to organize webinars focusing on specific geopolitical issues that could be part of one or more lectures planned for the summer courses in July. If you're interested in the program, you can find it on this LinkedIn page. And the enrollment campaign is open until March 31, so for those who want to join us. Today, we will be discussing Imperial Presidentialism and Exceptionalism with two young researchers, Dr. Giovanna Spanò, the summer school's operational manager, and Dr. Enrico Andreoli, a comparative public law lecturer of the University of Verona. I would like to warmly thank him for accepting our invitation. Since we are committed to respecting the time limit of 3/4 of an hour, I will refrain from sharing my thoughts on the topic, and I will immediately give the floor to Giovanna Spanò for her 20-minute presentation. Please, Giovanna, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paolo. I'll try to be brief and concise since this topic is quite challenging, and we'll try to demand for a very brief focus to the people hearing us. So, what about imperial presidency? So, Schlesinger used the term imperial presidency to describe the expansion of presidential power in the United States during the 20th century vis-à-vis the constitutional systems of checks and balances. He argued, nonetheless, that over time, president increasingly acted with autonomy and secrecies, more like monarch or emperor rather than political leaders. So, presidency was intended to be strong, robust, but constrained. However, it shifted. This meant that presidents increased authority, justifying action through necessity, urgency, and national survival. So, the process accelerated during periods of crisis such as war or international conflicts. Schlesinger pointed to the Cold War era when presidents justified extraordinary powers like military operation without formal declaration of war, abusing normative power, expanding intelligence and surveillance, for example, also controlling information to avoid scrutiny. But imperial presidency was not inevitable, tells Schlesinger. It was the result of precise political choice. 20th century was marked global wars and ideological confrontations and provided repeated opportunities for presidents to consolidate power, intended as exceptional and temporary, but in turn often became normalized and also embedded within the institutional practice. This perspective interplays with a very well-known theory, which is Colonel Swan, the going public. His central critique in the US context is that during the 20th century, presidents shifted from bargaining to speaking directly to the public in order to achieve political goals. So a key factor was precisely the growth of mass media. And platform allowed president to communicate directly with citizens by passing, for example, political parties or local representatives. Speeches, press conferences, or televised addresses become central tools instead of means of governance. Also, this shift contributed to the personalization of politics too. So public communication thus became a strategic resource instead of just a symbolic function. And imperial presidencies plus going public together provide a comprehensive framework able to explain how increased presidential power can interplay in a context of global leadership, technological change, or geopolitical competition. Schlesinger's argument focused on institutional growth of executive authority, whereas Kernel, by contrast, emphasized the transformation of presidential leadership, for example, in the strategy in domestic politics. But these two processes are perfectly complementary. From this perspective, presidential authority rests not only on constitutional structures, but also on their capacity to shape public opinion. Communication becomes a source of power, such as and comparable to military or diplomacy or, again, economic. Both theory highlights, not by chance, the role of crisis. So, kernel theory remains highly relevant. Presidents increasingly rely on direct communication, media framing, in order to influence outcomes. And as is well known, digital and social platforms have dramatically intensified this logic. So platforms facilitate rapid agenda setting and also a direct engagement with citizens. We can see at play the dynamics Schlesinger plus kernel because we have executive centralization plus public mobilization. And also, geopolitical competition can be played and occurs in the informational domain to say strategic narratives, campaigns, and moral suasion are central component of power. So again, statements, speeches, digital communication can affect financial markets, alliances, as well as deterrence and perception also about the enemy. But consequences are greater and broader. First, permanent campaigning. This means that communication is not episodic. So leadership becomes merged with media and public performance. Then personalist and populist dynamic, which means that presidents become the central actor and factors in geopolitics per and by themselves, and also information asymmetry and segmentation. Earlier form of going public relied on mass audience, whereas nowadays platform creates a fragmented and polarized public, and not least strategic aim, which means that public communication is not just a tool for domestic politics, but also operate in the international arena, crisis, diplomacy, and again, deterrence. So this concept is also crucial and offers crucial lens in order to tackle current or recurrent geopolitical patterns. So there is an underlying structural tension. Constitutional checks and balances operate slowly in a deliberative way, whereas geopolitics sometimes demand for rapid and abrupt decision-making processes, as we are witnessing nowadays. So Imperial presidentialism can be seen as an institutional adaptation to the momentum and also uncertainty of international politics. An emergency becomes a strategy in itself. Also, Schlesinger concept has proven highly adaptable and adaptive. New form of crisis such as terrorism, cyber warfare, or complex regional instability are able to further reinforce executive power and authority, especially in facing asymmetrical and decentralized threats. And this has also broader implications for the study of law and geopolitics. First, for example, for executive hubris, which means major power. Global strategies demand coherent and rapid responses. Crises as enablers. External threats foster executive power. Democratic tension. Centralization of power means suffering for democracy and legitimacy. So the international and domestic arena is affected also by the concept of accountability in this regard, and not least the comparative relevance. Though developed in the US, the concept can be applied also comparatively to other systems facing the generation of executive and geopolitical leverage. So these were some tips about imperial presidency, but what about exceptionalism? So why exceptionalism? These perspectives are deeply interconnected because it provides a normative and ideological framework that shapes how identities and international postures are understood. So exceptionalism becomes also indeed an ideological foundation for executive leadership, contributing also to the symbolic authority of the president. Going public allows threatening exceptionalist rhetoric, which in turn reinforces the centrality of President too. So social media and continuous communication enable presidents to construct and disseminate national narratives in real time. And in this case, exceptionalism become adaptive and flexible discourse, which is used to frame crises, justify policies, but also shape international perception and reputation. So presidential communication in this case become a form of soft power and a strategic tools. But this transformation too bears several consequences. Exceptionalism becomes more personalized and leader-centered. Also, national identity narratives are communicated globally, affecting and influencing, for example, alliance and partners, but also strategic narratives become instruments for and of geopolitical competitions. But in this regard, I open the discussion to my friend and colleague Enrico Andreoli, who extensively studied on the topic and about the aforementioned trends. So please, Enrico, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Giovanna. Thank you so much, Professor Passaglia, for this kind invitation. I'm very pleased to be here with you. So following on from what my colleague has already said so effectively, I would like to focus on some aspects of imperial presidency and exceptionalism, analyzing two highly topical issues related to two recent events that have affected US legal systems. Talking about imperial presidency, the scope of presidential powers and the mechanism of constraint, especially judicial review. This issue is highly topical in this moment, considering the recent Supreme Court ruling on the unconstitutionality of trade tariffs imposed by the President Trump. Talking about going public, that Giovanna mentioned, the transformation of institutional action into presidential political communication. In this regard, consideration should be given to the recent formulation of the US National Security Strategy, the document that is drawn up each year to set out the goals and priorities of US foreign policy mainly. Starting with the first of these two aspects, the mechanism of constraint to presidential powers, allow me to briefly mention what is meant by separation of powers in US constitutionalism. As known, Article 1 of the Constitution assigns legislative powers to Congress. Article 2 vests executive power in the President. This division mainly reflects the Madisonian theory articulated in the Federalist Papers. There was that number 47 and 51. One of them said ambition must be made to counteract ambition. This is the theory underlined in the separation of power in the US. This is true, but as often happens, theory says one thing, practice shows another. Indeed, over time, Congress has delegated broad normative discretion to the executive branch. This necessarily recalls the so-called non-delegation doctrine, according to which Congress may not transfer its legislative power without providing an intelligible principle. It is a doctrine first formulated by the Supreme Court in the case Hampton Jr. and Co. versus United States in 1928, more or less one century ago. Although the doctrine has been weakly enforced historically, it remains structurally significant. For example, it is precisely in this context that the question underlying the Supreme Court's decision on the unconstitutionality of the trade tariffs imposed by President Trump arose. given that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, an economic sanctions law, the act on the basis of which the president's power to impose tariffs was justified, represents a paradigmatic case of broad delegation in the context of national emergency power. A brief summary of the facts. As known, in February 2025, President Trump announced tariffs on Canada and Mexico and separately on China, citing the IEEPA as the statutory authority for doing so. After implementing other tariffs, Trump announced the Global Liberation Day tariffs, also citing the IEEPA the following April. Multiple lawsuits from affected companies and US states were filed shortly after this announcement, challenging the president's authority to issue those kind of tariffs. In one case, Learning Resources, the District Court for the District of Columbia ruled the tariffs were unconstitutionally, May 2025. In another one, Trump versus VOS elections, the US Court of International Trade ruled on May 2025 that the president does not have the authority to use the IEEPA to set tariffs in this way. The court's ruling, the Court of International Trade's ruling, was later upheld on appeal by the Federal Circuit in August 2025, but this is not important for our reasoning. The Supreme Court, this is the important part, granted both petitions in September 2025 and consolidated them into a single case. In its opinion on February 20, 2026, more or less 10 days ago, that the Supreme Court decided that this matter is within the exclusive jurisdiction of the Court of International Trade, so ordered the District of Columbia court case dismissed, the first one, the Learning Resources. At the same time, the court affirmed that VOS selection case, the case pending in front of the Court of International Trade, the Supreme Court affirmed the case ruling against the tariffs, so the first grade decision made by the International Court of International Trade. This is a discourse involving separation of power and the way that the U.S. constitutionalism provide a sort of counterbalance for abnormal use of power made by the presidency. The peculiarity of this whole argument lies precisely in what has been said above, as well as in what my colleague mentioned earlier when talking about imperial presidency. Theory says one thing, practice proves another. The day after the Supreme Court's decision, President Trump unilaterally decreed the imposition of new trade tariffs, calling the Supreme Court's ruling just an unfortunate decision. Moving on to the second issue that I mentioned, namely going public. This is a very interesting topic. I refer to the National Security Strategy, the 2025 National Security Strategy. And why? In the current debate on the repositioning of the US on the international stage, the starting point is exactly the publication of the National Security Strategy published on December 2025. Through this document, the current administration has made known to the world its vision and its foreign policy priorities. Effectively summarized in this sentence, the purpose of foreign policy is the protection of core national interests. That is the sole focus of this strategy. In its pragmatism, this statement makes clear in some ways the current set of operations carried out on the global stage during this Trump's second presidency, For example, also the Iran scenario that we are seeing in those days. Characterized by an attitude focused on ideological tension that redefines the global role of the US in a markedly nationalist key. I deliberately say ideological. The NSS is in fact both an ideological and programmatic manifesto, where the two terms are placed and must be understood in this precise order. The document's main purpose is to define a framework of priorities in which the international scenario becomes a tool for hegemonic political calculations with obvious internal repercussions, reinforced by a scenario in which the executive branch finds itself in a unique phase in which the legislative and judicial branches have little capacity to counterbalance it. The Congress is mainly in both chamber in a Republican majority, so the same that is expressed in the presidency, and the Supreme Court is in theory in a composition that in theory would have a sort of preference to the to these administration policies. I say in theory because, for example, the Supreme Court ruling on tariffs is exactly against the ideological representation of presidential policies, but as we saw, it is not so effective in this precise scenario. Returning to the NSS, in terms of priorities, the 2025 NSS is based on a number of key principles. The calibrated and targeted use of military force, the rejection of widespread interventionism. It is funny to say, but it is one of the key principles, and so-called global burdens deemed unrelated to the national interest. The preservation of a global balance of power that avoids the overextension of US resources, the centrality of economic power, reindustrialization, productive sovereignty as constituent components of national security. It is in this context that we can pose the tariffs discourse. The 2025 NSS marks a sharp break with the paradigm internationalism that has guided US foreign policy since the end of World War II. This is true in a formal sense. At 29 pages, it is a relatively short document compared to the standards we have become accustomed to in previous versions. And unlike those previous versions, whose tone tended to be academic or bureaucratic, the current NSS is explicitly an ideological document. As for the substance, several considerations are necessary. The first concerns, so to speak, its standing. The strategic document represents a fundamental break with the assessment of previous US administration, as I said. This assessment remained virtually unchanged for decades. Permanent global dominance by the US is in the best national interest of the US itself. In contrast, the 2025 NSS uses the perceived excessive expansion of the US on the international stage as a basis for justifying a narrower definition of that same national interest. The emphasis is thus placed on eliminating many global burdens, which, according to the current administration, have nothing to do with the national interest. The most recent withdrawal from a number of international organizations, decreed by President Trump on January 7, 2026, is perhaps the clear towards what I have called remunerative bilateralism. where the use of a political and economic instruments available in international relations is placed in a transactional perspective, conditioned, in any case, by measurable benefits for the domestic economy and security. Some concluding remarks should be made considering the latest development on the international scenario. Overall, the 2025 NSS is a highly personalized or personalistic document, which identifies the foreign policy of the US with the figure of the president and with the America First paradigm, adopting hyperbolic and partisan language that is foreign to the technical bureaucratic tradition of such documents. As such, however, it should not be read as a mere rhetorical exercise, but rather as the formalization of a structural change in the United States international standing, from global leadership to influence conditioned by the pursuit of national interest. Furthermore, going public, I return to this very specific topic that is very, very interesting to talk about. A distinctive feature of the text is the underlying mixture of foreign policy considerations and domestic policy objectives, to the extent that the strategic document seems almost more intended for a domestic audience than for international actors. National security is explicitly linked to a project of moral, spiritual, and cultural regeneration of US society, based on categories such as the traditional family, national identity, the rejection of the so-called DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. This approach betrays the highly politicized nature of the document, which goes beyond the boundaries of strategic planning to become a vehicle for an ideological vision of the international political order. Finally, but not finally, but finally in this consideration, because it is not the least important point, the democratic agenda, which has always been a bulwark of US strategic choices on the international stage, is at best secondary, with the guiding concept of democracy not abandoned, but placed on a nice-to-have level. The current foreign policy choices of the US, on the other hand, are explicitly conditioned by what makes them more powerful and economically prosperous. So, a radical change of course in this discourse of talking about foreign policies for the US. In form is certainly, in substance to a certain extent, given that the means used to pursue national interests have always been part of US strategic choices in foreign policy. The most significant innovation of the 2025 NSS is probably what is not written. And what is not written is a certain need for repositioning on international scenario. And this is why a policy discourse in the document, a politic discourse in the document. In the current international landscape, the US probably is no longer able to act as a hegemonic global and quasi-monopolistic power, which the end of the Cold War had allowed them to be. More than 30 years have passed since then, and the global economic and political balance has changed profoundly. Today, for example, just to mention some cases, China's presence as an equal player and Russia's geopolitical aggression are two factors that cannot be ignored in terms of the United States international standing. To reaffirm this in the eyes of the world and maintain its still unquestionable political dominance, because it is unquestionable right now, the choice has been made to retreat to a certain extent from the traditional posture of what has been defined modern atlas, opting instead for a logic of mere material advantage in international strategies. This is a fundamentally pragmatic approach which rhetorically leverages the deep sense of national pride in global supremacy that has proved so fruitful for the current administration in political terms. It is precisely in this sense that I spoke of going public, recalling what Giovanna was talking about. The 2025 NSS as a policy document in which the international scenario becomes a tool for international hegemonic political calculation made by the Trump administration. So a commixture between international document as a foreign policy international document and a very, very deeply political speaking document, but internally speaking. So speaking to the Republican elector or the American elector for this administration. And so those are the 2 points. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Enrico. Very interesting your 2 points, and you highlight several of the most relevant issues that are typical of the US system, of course, but not only of the US system. And maybe Giovanna Spanò wants to had something concerning not only what you said concerning the US, but also other countries. So I leave you the floor, Giovanna, please.
Thank you. I will try to start with his suggestion with some key points, just keeping all together, and then I'll try to just suggest some comparative example, which are also linked to different models of presidency, which can change according to time, places, and cultural, legal, political context. First, I think it was a very important statement about abnormous power. And Enrico mentioned that power becomes an aberration from the norm. This is quite evident in Schlesinger doctrine of imperial presidency, because we have the norm, we have legal framework, we have constitutional checks and balances, but presidency hubris or executive hubris means precisely this, that major power correspond to a deviation, which sometimes also leads to a degeneration of the form of government. This is quite evident in the Turkey case, which we see later, but it's also occurred in Tunisia, for example, which we had a totally aberration from the norm and also from the form of government. So the generation just led to a totally different regime from a constitutional point of view, and afterwards from the constitutional architecture of the system itself. Then afterwards, Enrico mentions that priority in policies often and very often displayed in non-official documents. This, I think, suggests the lack of long-term management of complexity. It is true that geopolitics sometimes demand, in spite of deliberative processes, rapid and abrupt decision-making process, but I think that government in general, in precise geopolitical contingencies, must be able to think with long-term management of complex scenarios. So priority in policies as key point, as bullet points in a non-official quasi-report documents is quite emblematic of the intellectual importance that some governments give to planning also relationship in the international arena. Then another 2 points, very briefly, ideology and ideological documents. This reminds, I'll be back later on this topic, about Bush and the document What We Are Fighting For After 9/11. So this means that some documents, though non-official, are able to be a sort of political manifesto disseminating a precise national identity, as I told before, also about exceptionalism. This means international posture. But this international posture does not just impact on the domestic sentiment of citizens, of public, but also in the greater arena of alliances, of geopolitical patterns, crises, and so on. And last, hegemonic patterns, and I would add prestige, which are very, very dear concept in comparative law. So I think that somehow the US is becoming a counter-hegemonic example, whereas other countries and systems and models are transforming themselves through courts. In the US case, we also quite the hegemonic example patterns allows also in the circulation of judicial judgment or idea, or also methodology of reasoning and so on, also claiming rights and promotion of rights. I think it's becoming a sort of counter-hegemonic example. This affects also its prestige and the possibility that the prestige role, once vested in the US system as a whole, now that's, I think, how can I say, overcome by other realities. Indeed, when speaking about imperial presidency, I think that it's just a shell which can contain and frame different dynamics depending on institutional structure, political culture, legal framework. It's not a single model. We, as comparatists, are quite used to think about models and different patterns that the model can save and have inside. And also this can spread different kinds of imperialism depending how and what kind of feature of the government can be reshaped by the personality or the public posture or the personalization of politics by each and every president or executive hubris. We can see that the US is the prototypic one, we can say with Israel, the prototypical case, but we have several additional cases, such as, for instance, Turkey and Argentina. In this case, we can have, in spite of diversity, some common feature. For example, they all are or have become presidential regimes. Each has experienced significant expansion of executive power over time, and also strong leadership is linked to national identity, as Enrico said, and also crisis management. But still we have different triggers and different models. In the US case, we can see in addition to the Cold War history, which Schlesinger points out, but the war on terror of the US under Bush is quite paradigmatic. Also because in here we can situate that document, non-official ideological document, which is what we are fighting for. It is full of, it recalls Christian roots in the US against the Islamic world and so on, this crusade against enemy. This is what I called also the capacity of and the ability of national narrative to spread globally, also influencing alliance and geopolitical patterns. But in the case of the Bush administration, there was posed a sort of existential threats. And Bush used, for example, narratives of security, democracy, global leadership, but consistent with that going public strategy. And Enrico very well said that this hegemonic pattern sometimes has been translated in the global leader role of the US, which now is a little bit introverted, or to say the least. And in the end, also, executive centralization was linked in the US case with the global role of the United States as security provider in addition to security leader. But We have also other models. For instance, Argentina, in this case, the leverage for an imperial presidency was not exogenous, but it was a domestic crisis. This means that imperial presidency can also emerge and be fostered by, for example, financial collapse. This was the case of Argentina, where presidential centralization was primarily aimed to restore trust, citizen trust, but also public trust. So, for example, there was a huge use of media, but also of populist narratives in order to bypass institutional opponents, resistance. So this hyper-presidentialism was driven by internal economic and social instability. The Turkey case is another totally different case because we are talking about restructuring the state. Because with Erdogan, following especially the 2016 attempted coup, we see that internal crisis, not financial, but a sort of challenging situation vis-a-vis the power of the president himself, led to a total reconstruction of the constitutional structure. This means that the extensive emergency measures that Erdogan displayed were reforms culminated in a constitutional shift toward a strong presidential system with a reversed paradigm from the emergency to the formal government instead of the US case, for example, or the Argentina case. So the Turkey's trajectory is a more systematic centralization of power. We just witnessed the translation of a parliamentary regime system to a presidential and hyper, maybe presidential structure. Also, all these ideas about centralization, neo-patrimonialism, such cases, because also Enrico underlined how everything is you can sell and buy everything in actual US and in current situation of US, and neo-patrimonialism is also one of the features of sultanistic regimes, which leans, for example, analyzed in different systems throughout the global scenario, and it has, I think, very points of intersection also with the concept of imperial presidency of Schlesinger, but one regards the state, the other the formal government. So I think it's interesting to see how they can interplay in a purely constitutional comparative sense. So all these cases I mentioned nonetheless reveal convergence and divergence. If we take into account the Schlesinger and Kellner dilemma in the literal sense of two premises still not alternative, we can see that we have crises are triggers. So, for instance, terrorism or economic collapse or attempted coup created opportunities for executive expansion, but also legitimacy through public mobilization. These both created the perfect geopolitical drivers to pave the way for imperial presidency. But also I think that this integrative framework can explain both the tension of the contemporary international landscape, but at the same time underline the central challenge of balancing global dynamic with democratic processes, the great missing point in contemporary geopolitics patterns, as well as institutional equilibrium and balance, because we are living in an increasingly competitive and intermediated arena. So I hope I have addressed all, Enrico.
Thank you very much, Giovanna. You remain under the 45 minutes that we had to respect, and thank you very much to both. It was very interesting, and this first webinar was quite interesting in order to develop the relationship between comparative law and the geopolitical approach that helps understanding both the geopolitical scenario and the way in which decision making and ultimately the law itself is constructed, is adopted. And we will try and focus on the geopolitical approach even for this completely different subject, and trying to manage comparative law and geopolitics as the summer school tries to explore in a deeper sense. So thank you, and see you in 2 weeks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye bye.